Welcome to another edition of the Energy Week podcast. Ryan Ray alongside the most famous person that I know, Dr. Energy herself, ellen-wald. Ellen, I've been in China, so I haven't got to see where all you've been, but I'm sure with the Aramco news and the IPO that you've been all over the world. Give me a quick 30-second to a minute update of what I've missed with the IPO, if anything.
Well, you missed the part where apparently the bankers went in to deliver their, final reading of evaluation, and it was not well taken. And apparently there was also, so some sources report there was a big to-do in Tehran that involved the Aramco people yelling at the bankers, which is always a good way to get the valuation you want, right?
Exactly.
Definitely yell at the bankers. And then all of the big time banks are basically off the whole deal. Aramco canceled all of the international roadshows that they've been planning to do. So they've been planning to do ones in the US, in Europe, and in Asia. Mm-hmm. And apparently they just canceled all of them, and they're going to go it alone in the Saudi sphere. Although now, just today, they reported that they are pitching to the Abu Dhabi sovereign wealth funds. And there is still potential for them to sell to, I think, Chinese sovereign wealth funds.
But they still are going forward with it, though, right?
Oh, yeah, they're going forward with it, but it's basically going to be all money from Saudi Arabia. Like, it's going to be all Saudi financial institutions, Saudi companies, and Saudi citizens, essentially.
What could go wrong?
Yeah, really. What could go wrong with that?
Well, I will
count the ways. I think I've written 5 articles explaining what could go wrong with that. Maybe 6.
Yeah, well, you probably could spend
you
another.
You can list them in the show notes if you want.
Yeah, put them in the show notes. Please do. You could probably write another 5 to 10 more and still not get all the potential things that could go wrong. So, as I mentioned our last show, I was over in China, and it was interesting. My first trip to China, Ellen, I will say this. They have a saying over there that goes like this: democracy does not equal efficiency. And based upon the amount of buildings that they're building...
Could we just take a step back? Whoever thought that democracy did equal efficiency? Like, democracy is basically the most inefficient way to do anything. I mean, like, were we supposed to believe that was efficient?
Well, no, I wasn't fooled by that. But when you've got literally thousands upon thousands and thousands and thousands of apartment complexes just going up and roads being built, I think that's kind of their way to spin it, to put it mildly, of why they're able to do all that stuff, is that because they're not a democracy, they're more efficient. So
more efficient, and yet they still can't find people to live in all of those buildings, right?
Yeah, that was. There was plenty of them that we wondered if anyone actually lived in or not. So I will say this: couple.
Sorry, I don't mean to rain on the Chinese efficiency parade here.
No. They didn't say communism equals people moving. So they didn't make that claim. They just said they could build a lot of stuff. A couple of things that were interesting. I asked a lot of questions about IMO 2020, and no one really seemed to have any interest in answering that. Not from the standpoint of they were ducking or dodging or avoiding the question. It just didn't appear to be on the radar of the people that I met with. So it could be I was in the wrong rooms or whatever, but I thought that would have been more of a discussion with some of these people that we're meeting with, but never really seemed to be a point of concern. And so I thought that was kind of interesting. I figured there'd be at least some talk about that from some of the energy professionals that we engage with. But anyways, I thought that was, we've talked about that a lot on the show, but over there, at least the circles that we were with, it never really registered that was an important piece of legislation. So I'm curious if that's very anecdotal evidence and not anything to wonder about, or if it's just not really on their radar. And February we read reports of China's out of compliance with IMO 2020. So I don't know what to make of it because it's too small of a sampling size, but it was interesting.
Yeah, but also I think if I recall correctly, they can say to their heart's content China is not in compliance with IMO 2020, and there's nothing they can actually do to China.
Well, yeah.
You're just not in compliance.
Because democracy does not equal efficiency. So,
Right. Democracy does not equal efficiency. Boy.
Well, I have been...
I'm gonna put that up on my on my wall here. I feel like that's a good thing to use, like, like if you're like, how like people say like this family is not a democracy.
Yeah.
Well, like the kids are dawdling, like, why do we have to put a democracy does not equal efficiency? Just do it.
Yeah, I will definitely be using that with my kids from time to time.
Try that out.
Yeah.
Let me know how that works as a parenting strategy.
I will. I will report back, especially with my 7-month-old. I will explain that to her.
Oh, yes.
And she will, I'm sure, capitulate easily. So, anyways, we have a guest coming on, so let's kind of hop into it. And let's start off with this one from the Boston Herald. We've got a natural gas ban. Is that what I'm reading? Because I mean, Ellen, we covered a story. It feels like last year where the Northeast was struggling during the cold winter because they didn't have enough natural gas. So, am I misremembering history or misreading this headline, or is it just we're repeating our same cycle here?
No, and I'm trying to load this article, which does not seem to want to load on my iPad. But anyway, so one of the reasons I thought this was interesting is not only because I used to live in Brookline, and I lived in an apartment building that did not have any gas at all. And we had electric heating. In fact, we had the most abominable electric heating. We had like, I can't remember what they're called now, but they're basically just units that go into the wall that weren't even rated for like temperatures below 40.
Wow.
And if anyone's been to Boston, it gets below 40 often, most of the time. And because of some other issues in my apartment, we were particularly cold and unable to get warm. So for me, this story was a bit of a kind of hit home with the fact that they're now saying in Brookline, and I happen to know people who are on the town meeting, as they call it. This is like a holdover, from like the days of pre-revolutionary New England, where they had, town meetings. And so they still have town meeting, and they have town meeting members. And I actually know some of the town meeting members, and I attempted to lobby them, despite the fact that I no longer live in Brookline, Massachusetts, against this this measure that would basically refuse any new natural gas hookups in any of the any new buildings. So if you're redoing an old building, you would be able to have natural gas or heating oil pipes. So great. So now in a very, very cold area, you can only use you can only use forced air.
Right.
What do they want you to? They demand that they all go electric, which we all know from experience is not very efficient. And in New England, where they don't have enough pipeline capacity when it gets really, really, really cold, essentially all of these new homes that will be running on electric heat will basically be burning oil or coal.
Yeah. Well,
because it's not like they're going to suddenly spring up new solar panels.
No.
New windmills.
Right.
In the middle of the winter, right?
Yeah.
So
we just talked about this last year, though. They had a problem last year, and the complaint was they didn't have enough natural gas. And now it's like, well, here we are this year, and you're saying, well, no, we didn't have it last year, and so the response to that is to prevent it this year. It's like, well,
well, they're saying it's so the issue before was that they didn't have enough of there's not enough big pipeline capacity. Right. Now they're saying individual houses can no longer have gas lines.
But you won't build more big pipelines if you can't.
So they won't build more big,
Right.
But even if they did have enough, they're now saying individuals can't even you can't even have that in your home, despite the fact that it's the most efficient way to heat a home in a place like Massachusetts. It's just like physically, like, do you really want, like, we had these horrible heaters that didn't heat the place.
Yeah.
So if we'd had gas heat, it would have been so much better. So it's interesting. It says the Northeast Gas Association at this time doesn't plan to sue Brookline, but other groups may take legal action. It's also interesting because utilities have like a mandate to like bring like the cheapest cost for the consumer. So I wonder if they could actually sue the town for like making it worse for them or something. I don't know.
I was talking to some folks the other day about nuclear and, why I'm pro-nuclear, this, that, and the other. And And I said, there's nuclear gets a lot of bad rap. And what I was told is, well, the people making policy, they're not anti-nuclear. They're not anti, various solutions. They're pretty practical. And I was like, I don't think so. That was my kind of response. And here's a good example of people making policy that aren't very practical and the solutions that they're giving to their people. And ultimately, either you're going to pay a substantial amount more, which means that you make people poor because they spend more on electricity, or they will eventually leave the area, which means people become poor because there's less jobs. And so it's, I don't buy into the notion that the people that make the either local or federal decisions on this are actually qualified, if you will, to understand these issues. And it's, we have hot summers down here in Texas, and we have expensive air conditioning bills, and I can't imagine being up in the cold Northeast and not being able to get cheap, reliable energy. Especially, I've never lived in the Northeast, but I can imagine it gets pretty miserable up there.
Oh yeah, it gets there's miserable, pretty miserable, and too cold to go outside because your face will freeze off.
Yeah.
I mean, it's so short-sighted, but you raise a really good issue, which is also that Brookline is one of the most expensive areas to live, and they're basically making it now more expensive because you have to pay for more expensive, heating and electricity, and so they're continuing to price people out of the area, and it's a very sought after kind of urban, sort of quasi-urban, quasi-suburban place that, you can live in and commute into the city either by bike or by walking or by public transportation and not actually have to drive in a car. And yet they're making it more difficult for people to move there, more expensive for people to live there. So they're pricing people out. And it's just I think it's just a really sad situation. And I guess I felt particularly strongly because I happen to know people who went and voted for this.
Right.
And it makes me very upset because, these are people that you actually know, and you think, well, maybe I can actually explain this to them,
right?
And in a way that maybe makes sense. And you realize how hard it is when people have this idea in their minds that natural gas is bad, fossil fuels are bad. It makes it's very hard to even when you approach it with logical things, it's very hard to change their minds. And I guess for me, it kind of hits home with how difficult the situation is when you're saying, look, natural gas is really a way better option than burning coal and oil. And you're standing in the way of that. Right.
And I would just suggest to anyone who is concerned about fossil fuel use, hop on the plane, land in Beijing, spend 3 or 4 days there. When you don't see the sun, it's not cloudy, it's smog. I can attest. I was just there. I think the Chinese are trying to do stuff, but I'll send you a picture we get off here I took a picture of the sun one day in Beijing, and it looks like it's overcast. And I was at the Great Wall. It was like it's full overcast, and it's not. It's just smog everywhere. And so they said it's gotten remarkably better over the past 5 years, but it's still a long way to go before you're, where I walk outside down here, unless it's cloudy, you can see, sun, sky, stars, all that kind of stuff. And so anyways, let's move along to oil demand. Here we go. CNBC, growth in global oil demand more than doubled in the third quarter to the IEA. I always get IEA, EIA, all those E's and I's and A's. And here's the interesting thing. China was the largest contributor, with demand increasing 640,000 barrels per day year on year. And then if you go down a little bit, it also comments that, let's see here, OPEC crude production came in at 29.9 million barrels a day, down 2.5 million from the same period last year. Of course, we know U.S. production at some point is going to have to slow off just because of the factors involved there. Ellen, are we headed to $300 oil?
Well, if I said that, then I'd probably get on CNBC, right?
Yes, you would. You would.
Yeah. Well, it's funny because the people on CNBC Asia did want me to come on for Wednesday. So that could have been my bombshell thing, except that I was then informed that all the studios are closed because of Thanksgiving.
Oh, well, the bombshell will have to wait till another day.
Yeah, maybe next week or the week after. Yeah. So yeah, no, I don't think we're heading to $300 oil, but I do think it's interesting because everyone's on this train of demand growth is falling off the cliff, and you know, where oil is dead. Oil is, you know, there's no more growth in oil. We've reached peak. I love how now it's just like they're like peak oil. And someone said, "Well, what do you think about peak oil?" I'm like, "Well, okay, so there's peak oil supply, which was the big thing, you know, 10 years ago, and there's peak oil demand, which is the big thing now." So which would you like to discuss? Which are we talking about? Peak oil means it's just like a nothing phrase.
Right. Well, and, you know, they mentioned China.
I mean, unless you're talking about like peak oil, like we should just stop talking about it because there's nothing more to talk about.
We peaked out on our oil discussion.
Peaked out on our oil discussion.
You know, it's interesting because the Chinese claim that they've got a middle class of 400 million people now, which is larger than the population of the United States. If I understood correctly, and the delegation kind of argued over the numbers because not we were arguing with each other. We were trying to argue. We were arguing over what we'd heard, and so I'm gonna throw this out there, and it could be wrong. There were some people who thought they heard it differently, but my understanding was they've got 400 million in middle class status, 900 million in poverty class. And so if you start to look at that and you say, well, that 900 million becomes more middle class, what's going to happen?
Yeah. And this is what people are saying. You know, people are like, I was on a podcast earlier, like last week, where they're like, well, you know, fossil fuels are bad. We have to stop burning them. We have to stop. I was like, well, look, you know, this is a big thing in Western Europe and also the United States, but you want to go tell some people in Africa and in Asia that we wrecked the world, so now you can't get out of poverty? I mean, are you really going to tell these countries in Africa that are discovering all this like offshore oil that they can't exploit that oil because I'm sorry, like you already did it? I mean, do you really want to make that argument?
Yeah, because
this is it.
That's great because essentially what you're saying is to a 20-year-old in rural, poor area of Africa, your life must remain poor. And you must live in extreme poverty your whole life in hopes that we figure out whatever we're saying that's going to happen with the planet. So just sit where you're at and hope that we figure it out. And maybe by the time you're 70, we'll have this all worked out. But that's just not a very convincing argument to someone who is living in extreme poverty.
No.
And so,
and until they can offer something better, until there's a better argument, you can't. I'm sorry, but you can't do this. You either just have to talk about either like cleaner things to do, like you can say to China, look, you want to burn all that coal, fine, but you already know that your atmosphere is gone to crap. So like install some scrubbers on your coal plants, please. Like we know how to clean up the atmosphere. We know how to clean up the water. Like why don't we at least help these countries not destroy their environment, their water and their air becoming, industrialized, because that's actually something that we do know how to do. They spend a little bit more.
Here is one thing that China has going for it on that point. They have these free trade zones, and they have a couple different things, but free trade zones, let's use that term, and it allows for international companies to come there and do research and development. And they do a JV with the local government or federal government and a local business. But what happens is, and this I thought was pretty ingenious on the Chinese part, because they have less regulations to put something to market. If you want to try out a new scrubber technology, you can go to China, you can build it for cheaper, and you can get to market cheaper. And then, as you know, once you get to market, you can start to test all the variables and make sure it actually works itself out. Whereas if you want to deploy that technology in the United States, you got to go through the EPA or whoever, and it's so China will actually have a potential for an advantage on some of this stuff because they can try out mitigating technologies like that at a faster rate than other countries, because they do let things go to the market quicker. They have a large market there, and so if you want to try out scrubbing technology, okay, come here. The standards for entry is lower. Once it gets out there, you can try it out, see how it works. If it works out, great. You can send it over to America or to Europe or to Africa. And so I thought that was a really good thing that China has going for it, because they do have a problem, and you let companies come there try to solve it instead of putting some extreme regulation on them. You put it on the market and see how it works.
Yeah, exactly. And that sounds like a great idea. I just, it's hard to maybe to explain to people that just because oil demand growth in, say, the developed world is kind of maybe the growth seems to be leveling off. It doesn't mean that there isn't going to be growth coming from other parts of the world.
Yeah. Africa and all those places. You're right.
I just think it's very short sighted. It's like people do this all the time. It's like they take either the growth rate now or the decline rate now, and they assume that it's going to like increase at or decrease at the same exponential rate as always, and like that, and that's going to be the trajectory always. And it's like, no, those things change all the time. Like you can't assume it's going to be the same. It's going to continue at the same rate, or it's going to increase exponentially. It's like, just stop. I mean, I know it makes predicting the future harder, but like, better to say we don't know than to say it's going to be this and just be wrong.
Right. Okay. One more story before we get to our guest. I'll let you pick. We're going to talk about the Gulf security
let's talk about Tesla. We got to talk about Tesla. Come on. How can we not talk about the Tesla truck? Guys, the Tesla truck.
Does it look like a DeLorean to you? Like it has the DeLorean feel to me. Like I saw, I was like, I look at the DeLorean.
It looks like a triangle. It looks like it looks like something that I made for my geometry class in 10th grade.
It looks like a Mars rover. Yeah, it looks like something to take to Mars and deploy it out there.
Yeah, I mean, it is not. Okay, I live in Jacksonville, Florida, which is like pickup truck capital of the world. I'm guessing that you probably live in a place with a lot of pickup trucks.
A lot of trucks.
I don't know.
Yeah, Texas is full of trucks. Yeah,
a lot of pickup trucks. I cannot see anyone ever driving this, and I will admit that the proportion of Teslas or the number of Teslas sedans that I see on the road in my little neighborhood has definitely increased. Okay. I cannot see anyone ever drive. I mean, like, what is it? It looks like, it looks like a dinosaur. Okay. Did you ever see that TV show? It was like these people get transported to like, I think either they're going like back in time to Earth and there are dinosaurs there. It was supposedly created by the same people who created Star Trek The Next Generation, which is probably why I watched it. It was on a couple of years ago. It only lasted for like a season, if that, and then it got canceled. But they had these cars that were like the most ridiculous things that you would ever use if you were living in a place with dinosaurs, because they were like open on the sides, but they looked really squat and like they looked kind of like this. This is like the aesthetic. Like the wheels never had this aesthetic. It's just like, imagine if there were like no doors.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So yeah.
Yeah, and I'll just say this, just real quickly, is that we've talked about this before, is that the Tesla stuff appears to be mainly for people in big cities. They're not going 500 miles. That might sound like a lot, but you get out in like the West Texas area, you're driving between meetings or whatever. That's a lot of miles actually that you can put on. I mean, I've driven 500 miles. You just so 250 miles is kind of the base range. Again, it sounds like a lot, but that's roughly from here to Houston for me. I make that trip all the time, and then and so you're kind of stuck on a charge.
Plus, put heavy stuff in your truck or your towing stuff, right. Because pickup truck like around here, like everyone in their lawn service has a pickup truck,
right?
Like you're going to put something in that truck, you're going to turn on the air conditioning or the heater. You're not getting 500 miles on battery. No way.
And then
way.
Right, and then I don't know I haven't heard this be addressed, but you're talking about flat terrain. You're talking about up and down hills. And so I think it's again, if you're in downtown Fort Worth, you want to putt around, or DFW kind of metroplex, but you get out in kind of the rural parts of America where people are using trucks for things like you're talking about, probably not as viable, and the windows aren't very durable either.
Also, like this, I like it says also Tesla's Cybertruck looks nothing like a traditional pickup. Pickup truck buyers may want to stand out, but it's unclear if they'll be comfortable with standing out quite so much. But that's another thing. There's also the thing like pickup truck drivers, like some of them drive the truck because they like to rev the engine and stuff like that. And you don't get that with an electric car. Now, there is an actual market, I think, for an actual electric pickup truck, which is like campuses of places. So like take like a college campus. They're going to want to have pickup trucks to go out and do repairs and stuff. And it actually makes a lot of sense for them to be electric because they don't need to drive them that many miles. And it actually probably is easier for them to just charge it up at the end of the day than to fill it with gasoline. Tesla is clearly not marketing their product at this market.
Right. And I think the other thing you mentioned, I remember when I first got in the oil and gas industry years ago, if you drove a Toyota man, they would just rag you because that's not an American truck,
Yes.
And so there is a cultural thing where, and it's a little bit different today. You see a little bit more diversity in the vehicles, but there is something to that that cultural aspect of it. Obviously, Tesla now they have the big factory in China, but there's something to that Ford or Dodge or Chevy. You got that American blood running through you, and it, and so I think a lot of things you mentioned about revving the engine. There's a lot more. There are some truck owners who are very practical. They just need a truck and they don't care about anything else. But there's a lot more that goes into owning a truck than, your Toyota Camry owners. This is a little bit of a different culture, by and large. And so I think that will be interesting to see how it plays out. But, they're claiming they've got, of course, the deposit's only like $100. So I guess, I don't know if you can get out of that pretty easy, but they're claiming they got a little orders on a $100 deposit.
All right. Well, we shall see.
Up next, we have on Lord Barker of Battle, former UK climate change minister. Lord Barker, how do I address you as with such a distinguished title?
Your lordship.
Well, Ryan, just call me Greg. That will do just fine.
That will do just fine. Well, thank you for that. We appreciate it. Real quick, for folks like myself who come up in the southern part of the United States, why don't you explain where the title Lord comes from and kind of give us a quick background on how you were bestowed such a title?
Sure. Well, I was a member of the British House of Commons for 15 years and stood down in 2015. And then the upper house of the UK Parliament, like your Senate, is actually still composed of lords, has been done for nearly 1,000 years. Now, most of them, there are still a few who inherit their titles that sit there, like the Duke of Wellington, for example, you might have heard of. But it's by and large composed of people who are actually created lords for life by the Prime Minister of the day. So David Cameron, who was then Prime Minister in 2015, very kindly, after I left the House of Commons, created me what they call a life peer. So I'm a lord, but just for life, which means that it's not inherited by my son and my grandson or my grandson's son, as would have happened in the olden days. It's just for life. But I sit in the upper house of the British Parliament as a result. But it's unlike sitting in the House of Commons, it's not a full-time occupation. There are about 600 of us, and that come drawn from all walks of life and all political parties. And it's a lot less partisan than the House of Commons, or at least it's supposed to be, and draws from a much wider range of people these days, not just the old aristocracy. So that's it. But I'm very lucky to be Lord Barker of Battle. Battle, your listeners may know, is the town which is very ancient in the UK, has great significance because it's named after the site of the Battle of Hastings of 1066,
really?
Over 1,000 years ago. And that was the last time that a foreign power successfully invaded Great Britain. That's when the Normans defeated the Saxons at battle in 1066.
So
Lord of Battle.
So I've got to interject here. This is Ellen, because first of all, I love the show Victoria on Masterpiece, and so yes, I'm familiar with the Duke of Wellington, and I also have a PhD in history. It's American history, but I did get a chance to spend some time in England, and in the course of that, I actually went to France and I got to see the big tapestry depicting the Battle of Hastings, which I found incredibly humorous because it actually read much more like an old-timey comic strip than...
Yeah, it's the original cartoon.
Yeah, and that was just hilarious. And so I love that your lordship is named after that particular battle, which is and I advise anyone who ever has a chance to go to that part of France should go and take a look at that tapestry because it's hilarious and also a really cool part of history. So
and 1,000 years old.
1,000 years old. Yeah, that's one thing when you deal with folks from Europe, they have a lot more history than we do in the States.
It's so true. I was a scholar at Cambridge University, and I was living in Churchill College, which is like the youngest college, and I'd go to these other colleges, and you'd step on the stones, and they were like worn away just because thousands of years people had actually been walking on them. And I think to myself, we have nothing like this in the United States. Like, we think something is old. It's not old. It's not old at all.
I don't know. Harvard and Princeton, those places aren't too shabby. There's some lovely historic sites.
Okay, well, let's get on with it. Let's talk about. I'm going to ask you a two-part question here. As we mentioned, you're you used to work with the former minister of climate change in the UK. Let's talk about what role did you play there, or what does that role actually entail as far as like a day-to-day operation when you were functioning there, and then. We've talked a lot on the show about renewable energies and kind of how that works itself out. We read a lot of headlines from Europe, from the UK. Second part would be is where does sustainable energy come from in the UK moving forward? We hear a lot about fossil fuels, the recent ban on fracking, wind farms. So kind of walk us through the state of energy at a very high level, if you would.
Sure. Well, the UK, under both parties, both the Labour Party and my party, the Conservative Party, has been at the forefront of the fight against man-made climate change for nearly 2 decades now. And in 2008, the British Parliament passed an act called the Climate Change Act, which was the first of its kind anywhere in the world, which unilaterally committed the UK to reducing its carbon emissions by 80% from 1990 levels. That was before the Paris Agreement of 2015. It was before the failed attempt internationally in Copenhagen in 2009. It was the first major economy to legally commit to reduce our carbon emissions by a dramatic amount, by 80%. And after that was passed, they then needed somebody in government to have responsibility for enforcing and coordinating that effort, and a department for energy and climate change was created. And when David Cameron came to power in 2010, he appointed me the Minister for Climate Change, which a role that I filled for 4 years till 2014, when I stepped down ahead of leaving Parliament the following year. But it was a fantastic time for me because we were really laying the foundation of many of the successful policies that we see today. So created the Green Investment Bank, which primed private sector investment in the renewable energy sector and the green economy. And as a result of that, and the government policy of support for renewable energy, the UK has made massive strides in deploying renewables. So we now have the world's largest offshore wind resource. We have a great onshore wind resource. We have nearly a million people with solar panels on their roof. We have huge amounts of solar that is on industrial and commercial applications. We have biomass and even wave and tidal energy. And we have phased out coal almost completely now. So as a result of shifting away from coal and towards renewables, we have been able to dramatically reduce our carbon emissions. So I mentioned that we set a target in 2008 of reducing our emissions by 80%. Since then, the UK economy has continued to grow, but our carbon emissions have dropped. Do you have any idea, Ryan or Ellen, how much the UK has been able to reduce its carbon emissions by since that time?
I do not.
I'm not. It's about 45% currently. So carbon emissions are down 45%, which is a very dramatic shift, and shows what can be done if you apply your mind to it. And that's primarily been driven by a straight switch from fossil fuels to renewables, and most importantly, phasing out of coal. And gas has actually been a very valuable partner in that process. Without the increased use of gas as an intermediate step, we would never have been able to have got off coal in the way that we have. So gas has been a very important ally in the deployment of renewables, both as a baseload replacement for coal and also as a standby for the use with intermediate renewables. But I'm really proud of what we have achieved in the UK, and I think it serves now as an example for other major industrialized economies that you can do this at scale. And what's more, it's getting cheaper and cheaper by the day. The cost of renewables, as I'm sure you know, has fallen dramatically. Offshore wind, for example, has more than halved since we began the current program in 2010.
So I have a couple questions. We actually spoke earlier on this podcast about natural gas and how it's a shame that some communities see it as an enemy as opposed to a really important step away from heavier carbon polluting forms of energy. I would like to ask though. So one of the interesting things I recall, I think this was from about a year ago in 2018, there was a proposal, at least before Parliament, that Britain should ban gasoline and diesel fueled cars. I think it was by sometime in 2030. I don't think it was 2030, maybe 2032, in order to kind of help move along this shift to electric vehicles and zero emission vehicles. I don't recall if it was passed, probably not, but I'm curious what your position on this is. Do you see this as like our bans on these kind of cars? Are they something that you would have supported? Were you, still climate change minister?
Yeah, absolutely. The switch to electric vehicles powered by electricity that comes from a clean source of energy is absolutely critical in terms of decarbonising ground transport. So setting a long-term target that gives both the consumer and manufacturers time enough to make that switch allows the consumer to make sensible purchasing decisions and not get caught out, allows manufacturers the time to invest in new production facilities and switch their R&D efforts, actually acts as a spur to innovation and to growth, in fact. I remember when I was minister being shown a chart around energy efficiency by Stephen Chu, the Obama-era Nobel Prize-winning energy secretary, demonstrating that if you have long-dated efficiency regulations, they actually act as a spur for certainly the automotive industry and other related industries in terms of investment and innovation and growth. And where you just have flat standards, actually you see a plateau in growth. So used smartly and provided they're done with the industry, actually smart intervention like that to drive innovation can really be a very powerful tool. And certainly we have to decarbonize ground transport, which primarily means cars and buses and lorries, by the early 2030s. But many, certainly European and Asian, and in fact American companies are leading that shift to electric vehicles already without government intervention. So government intervention is really just driving the rest of the industry where many of the manufacturing leaders are already going.
I gotta be honest with you. I mean, both Brian and I come from places where it's essentially illogical and inefficient to own an electric vehicle at the current, state of electric vehicle technology. It wouldn't make sense given the range limitations for most people in the kind of places where we live, given how expensive it is, and also so we're a bit skeptic about bans on this. For me, how do people in England
the key point
do
there?
this?
The key point there is the current state of technology, the current cost. And what we have to remember, this is a journey and things are moving very, very quickly now. We're driving at a real pace of change. So you're absolutely right. As things stand at the moment for electric vehicles, they are most applicable to people making shorter journeys, particularly in urban areas. They're less practical for people in sparsely populated rural areas who make much longer journeys. Absolutely. But that is changing, and the costs are coming down. The battery strength is improving. So you're absolutely right. But history doesn't stand still. I mean, you're probably talking about areas that, 100 years ago were actually very skeptical of that they could use motor cars and were still very much attached to horses. So things do move on.
Let me ask this. One of the things I just got back from China, and what was interesting is they're obviously pushing, the EV and looking forward to that. And I didn't realize that. I think it's the number 1 and 2 battery manufacturers for EVs are coming out of China. When we look at this industry moving forward, is there a lot of? It feels like China might be the hub of kind of EV technology, but there was some European countries that were going down there for research and development, and I was commenting that one of the advantages of the Chinese market earlier is there is less regulation, so you can kind of get your product to market, test it in the wild. Do you think that will be one of the things that helps the EVs, is that there are companies from America, from the UK, from Europe, going to China and testing out this technology that will help speed it along to meet some of these kind of long lead regulations?
That I'm not sure about. I'm not an expert on electric vehicles, but I do know that there is a lot happening in Europe. Tesla have just announced the creation of their hub in Germany, and the UK is investing heavily in the UK in the electric vehicle manufacturing sector, and batteries are a key component of that. Batteries, transport electric charging infrastructure. I myself am a partner in a young electric vehicle infrastructure charging business here in the UK, as well as chairing the N Plus Group, which is the world's largest private sector producer of aluminium, which of course is essential for electric vehicles, being a lightweight metal, as it is essential for many other energy efficient applications.
Yeah, and let me just shift gears here. Help when you were at the climate change. One of the things that you look at is I kind of thrown this out there before, that energy policy shouldn't be monolithic, because you have big cities like London and then you have sparse areas. I'm not familiar with all the cities in the UK, but like where I live is the whole county is 55,000 people, but I'm 45 minutes from DFW, which has multiple million people. How did you guys go about trying to evaluate policies that would work for big metropolitan areas compared to small areas? And then moving forward, how does that need to be part of the discussion when we talk about energy policy and regulation?
Well, I think really energy policy, firstly, when you're talking about electricity, is pretty uniform. We have a national grid in the UK. Everyone is pretty much, we have 99.9% of the population is connected to the grid. And so it's not about how you distribute electricity, it's about what you put in and where you put in it. And certainly in a country that's, compared to the United States, is relatively small. We have a large population, but a relatively small land size. Actually, it's just about making sure that you have enough clean energy wherever it's generated around the country to supply the needs of the population. And the fact whether that population is in London or in the Scottish Highlands, that's more to do with just grid management rather than different requirements of individual communities. Where you do have a difference is in heating, cooling to a degree, although we're not so keen on air conditioning as you guys are in America. But heating is a real issue. In towns, where you have people living in terraced housing or blocks of flats or semi-detached housing, certainly in much greater density, it's easier to insulate properties and to insulate multiple properties very efficiently. It becomes much more difficult when you get into rural areas. Often you're dealing with older properties that don't have cavity walls that make it harder to insulate, or they require solid wall insulation. And then it is more difficult, and it's less efficient for the contractors to get around makes it more expensive for the contractors to get around those sort of sparsely populated areas. So it's really in terms of how you heat rural homes and how you insulate them. That's the big definition, rather than how you supply them with electricity.
So Buckingham Palace has its insulation been upgraded recently? Curious if there's any kind of, those kind of large homes are notoriously difficult to keep warm. Are there any kind of special, efficiency upgrades that can be expected in those famous buildings?
In Buckingham Palace, I don't know, you're more advanced than I am. I'm sure the Queen is very frugal with the heating, and I know that, and I have had the privilege of working with the Prince of Wales, Prince Charles, in the past while I was in government. I know he's a real inspiration on climate action, and he has been talking about this agenda for practically longer than anybody else that's still active in the climate space. He's been a real visionary, and I know that he has deployed all sorts of innovations and applications to help reduce the carbon footprint of their homes and the way they run. But it is a challenge. Old properties, particularly drafty castles, are quite a challenge.
Yeah.
But then it comes down to what you heat them with. But if you're using sustainably grown biomass, if you're using more solar panels for electricity, it makes the carbon footprint of those homes much lower. And obviously, the embedded carbon in the building is now spent. If the building went up 1,000 years ago, like Windsor Castle, you can be pretty much sure its carbon footprint is better by now.
Right. One final question before we get you out of here. Let's talk about the North Sea. What role? Obviously, the North Sea gets a lot of attention historically. What kind of headlines should we expect to read about the North Sea moving forward? You've mentioned offshore technology for wind and wave. Will that dominate the North Sea discussion? Is it going to be oil, or will it be a mixture of things as we move forward with kind of this transition?
Yeah, that's great. The fascinating thing about the North Sea is that it's going to continue to be an energy supplier to the UK economy. Now, historically, since the 1970s, that's meant oil and gas. And there is still a significant amount of oil and gas below the North Sea, which the government is still intent on extracting because, we are clear we need to decarbonize by 2050. But until that time, we still have to supply oil and gas to the UK population. And if we don't take it out of the North Sea, it's going to come from Saudi Arabia or I don't know, places in the Middle East or whatever. Much better if you have to use it that you produce it domestically for the oil and gas. But then we're obviously looking over time and hopefully sooner rather than later to reduce and ultimately eradicate our use of oil and gas, but that's not going to happen overnight. So we've got to be sensible about it and continue to extract oil and gas so far as we need it. But as the extraction rates from the North Sea begin to decline, so we are powering up with offshore wind, and the engineering required for these vast offshore wind plants. To give you some idea, that is as tall as some of the largest skyscrapers in the City of London in the financial district, with a blade span larger than the London Eye. I don't know if you or any of your listeners have been to London and have seen the big Ferris wheel that we have on the South Bank there. Huge. The blade span of these turbines is massive. It would dwarf St Paul's Cathedral. Massive feats of engineering, and there are now hundreds, if not thousands, of these installations out across the North Sea on the shallows, particularly on the shallow sandbanks, which are some way out. And this is creating a massive energy source for the UK. And it's proving to be increasingly reliable as well. It's much more predictable, the wind that is, out at sea than on land. And the North Sea seems to be a pretty reliable source of wind. Obviously, it is intermittent. There are times when the wind drops. But the more you have, the more likely it is that it's always going to be blowing somewhere.
Great. Thank you for that. Okay. I know we're up against the clock, so let me ask you this. If there's a spot where folks can follow your work or connect with you somehow, please let us know so we can leave that in the show notes. And, of course, Ellen's going to kick me for asking this, but who is your Premier League team?
Who is my Premier League team? Chelsea. And you can find me on Twitter at Greg Barker UK.
Okay, we'll be sure to link to that in the show notes so listeners can follow your work. As a Man United fan, I was disappointed in that answer, but we will let it slide for this podcast.
I am totally, I'm carbon neutral on your Premier League choices, so go for it.
Fantastic. Very nice to talk to you guys.
Thank you so much for your time today, sir.
Thank you.
Okay, cheers, bye-bye.
And that was Lord Barker of Battle. Just a little side tip here.
Which apparently refers to the most famous battle.
Yes.
The Battle of Hastings. I learned something new today.
I learned something too. If you have kind of the cottonmouth going on, saying Lord comes out as Lloyd. So.
Oh, boy.
I kept trying to drink my tea over here, but I got to sip there. But yeah, Lord Barker of Battle. I called him Lloyd, I think, 4 times before we brought him on the air, poor fella. He's a Chelsea fan, so we will hold that against him in the future. But that was an interesting insight, and we'll be sure to link to his Twitter on the show notes. Ellen-Wald, where will you be between now and Thanksgiving? Anywhere? Taking the week off?
I don't think so. I'm gonna be eating turkey. I'm gonna be baking pies and eating turkey.
I did see something on the Twitterverse about you cooking some Thanksgiving pies or cookies or something.
I did.
Like that.
I made pecan pie, which I'm gonna go on record here.
It's not pecan. It's not pecan.
Pecan.
Thank you. It's
pecan
not
pie.
yeah,
okay.
Yeah.
Like I said, I'm a Philly girl originally, so I'm also going to go out there and say that I actually don't like it.
Oh, really?
And I'm not going to eat it. No, I much prefer pumpkin. But the in-laws love
pecan pie.
Pecan pie.
It's Iran.
This pie is going straight to the in-laws.
It's Iran and pecan. Okay.
Pecan. All right. I will say pecan if you could say Iran.
I can't say Lord, much less anything else. So. Okay, well, that is it for today's show. We will be back next week. We've got, I think, 3 episodes before the year closes out. Something like that, 3 or 4 episodes.
Exciting.
Yes, so wish all the listeners a great Thanksgiving, and we will talk to you next week.